When 38-year-old botanist Dr. Emma Reynolds purchased an abandoned farmhouse in rural Vermont for her dream plant research center, a hidden letter in a decaying barn led her to a startling discovery. She uncovered evidence that the elderly woman who sold her the property was actually Caroline Harrison, the missing heiress to a $75 million shipping fortune who had vanished without a trace over 60 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sunlight filtered through the dust-covered windows of the farmhouse as Emma carefully unfolded another stack of yellowing papers. At 38, she possessed a unique combination of scientific precision and intuitive understanding that had made her one of the most respected plant researchers at Cornell University's Department of Plant Biology. Her copper-red hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes narrowed as she studied the brittle documents before her. Emma's colleague and mentor, Professor David Mitchell, often remarked that her ability to trace plant lineages through DNA analysis rivaled forensic scientists in accuracy. Emma could identify rare botanical specimens by examining cellular structures, growth patterns, and genetic markers with remarkable precision. Her specialization in endangered plant species had begun almost by accident during her undergraduate years at the University of Michigan. While researching a paper on sustainable agriculture, she had stumbled upon references to a network of amateur botanists who had secretly preserved endangered plant species during the rapid industrialization of the 1950s and 1960s. What started as a footnote in a term paper had evolved into a master's thesis and eventually into doctoral research that was breaking new ground in understanding how private citizens had sometimes done more to preserve biodiversity than government programs. Her academic credentials were impressive by any standard. Emma had graduated summa cum laude from Michigan with a double major in botany and environmental science. Her undergraduate thesis, Green Guardians, Civilian Plant Preservation During Industrial Expansion, had won one of the university's highest honors for undergraduate research and had been published in a prestigious scientific journal while she was still in college. The thesis had examined how ordinary citizens had created informal networks to preserve endangered plant species when commercial development threatened natural habitats. During her doctoral program at Cornell, Emma had gained access to previously private gardens and botanical collections through research partnerships with historical societies and private estates. Her doctoral dissertation, Hidden Gardens: The Secret History of Plant Preservation from 1940 to 1980, had documented the extent to which private citizens had influenced conservation efforts during periods of rapid development and industrialization. But Emma's expertise extended far beyond academic research. She had spent her summers working at some of America's most prestigious botanical gardens and conservation organizations, learning practical skills of plant propagation and preservation that no classroom could teach. At the New York Botanical Garden, she had worked under the legendary conservationist Dr. Marcus Landry, who had taught her to identify endangered species, preserve rare specimens, and recognize the subtle signs of plant stress that could indicate environmental changes. Her summer fellowship at Kew Gardens in London had provided exposure to the high-stakes world of international plant conservation, where Emma had learned to research plant lineages, authenticate rare specimens, and evaluate the ecological importance of threatened species. She had been present when Kew Gardens had successfully propagated a plant thought to be extinct for over 50 years, and she had helped authenticate specimens that revealed previously unknown medicinal properties. Emma's work at the Chicago Botanic Garden during her second fellowship had focused specifically on prairie restoration and native species conservation. Under the supervision of Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, the garden's leading expert in restoration ecology, Emma had learned to identify authentic native species, distinguish between different ecological communities, and understand the complex systems that supported diverse plant populations. The practical experience had taught Emma to read landscapes not just for their current condition, but for the story told by their physical characteristics. She could determine the approximate age of a woodland by examining the tree rings, soil quality, and understory composition. She could identify whether a meadow had been previously farmed or remained untouched by recognizing subtle differences in soil structure and plant diversity. Emma's knowledge of plant history was encyclopedic and constantly expanding. She had read every major book about American botanical history, from academic studies to memoirs by pioneer conservationists. She could recite the scientific names of hundreds of native plant species and detail their historical ranges, uses, and conservation status. She understood the organization of plant communities, the methods they used to adapt to changing conditions, and the ways they had responded to human interference over centuries. Her academic advisor, Professor Mitchell, had often remarked that Emma seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how plant communities functioned. She could read between the lines of disturbed landscapes to identify what had been lost or altered, and she had developed theories about plant succession that later proved accurate when historical photographs or documents were discovered. Her ability to synthesize information from multiple sources and identify patterns that others missed had made her research invaluable to other scholars studying ecological history. Emma's personal interest in conservation had been sparked by family stories about her grandmother, Lillian Reynolds, who had maintained an extensive garden of native plants during the suburban expansion of the 1950s. Lillian had been passionate about preserving native species that were being bulldozed for housing developments, and family stories suggested that her conservation efforts had involved more than simple gardening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lillian had died when Emma was 15, but she remembered her grandmother's vast collection of pressed plants and her habit of corresponding with other gardeners across the country while taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. The connection between Emma's family history and her academic interests had deepened when she began studying her great-aunt Margaret Reynolds, her grandmother's younger sister. Margaret had always been the mysterious figure in the Reynolds family. Unmarried, well-traveled, and possessed of knowledge and resources that seemed to exceed what a rural schoolteacher should reasonably have. Emma's parents had often wondered aloud how Margaret could afford to travel to Europe several times a year and maintain an impressive collection of rare botanical books on a teacher's salary. Margaret Reynolds had owned a small farm called Wildflower Haven in rural Vermont for over 50 years. Emma had spent countless childhood summers working in the gardens, learning to catalog plants, research their origins, and understand the complex relationships within natural ecosystems. Margaret had been an extraordinary teacher, possessing an almost supernatural ability to locate rare plant species that other botanists couldn't find, and to propagate specimens that stumped other experts. Wildflower Haven occupied a picturesque 80-acre property in the rolling hills of northern Vermont. The property had been established in 1955, and Margaret had purchased it in 1960 when the previous owner, an elderly woman named Edith Crawford, had decided to sell. Margaret had paid cash for the property, a transaction that had surprised Emma's parents, given that Margaret had never seemed particularly wealthy. The farm itself contained a remarkable diversity of habitats, from open meadows filled with native wildflowers to dense woodland areas harboring rare understory species. Margaret had maintained extensive gardens that included plants that weren't commonly found in Vermont, or even in the northeastern United States. The property included several greenhouses, cold frames, and specialized growing areas that Margaret had somehow funded through channels she never fully explained. The farm attracted an unusual variety of visitors: university researchers, conservation Specialists and botanical enthusiasts from around the world would make the journey to the remote Vermont location. Emma had often noticed that many visitors seemed to know exactly what plants they wanted to see and where Margaret would have planted them, suggesting relationships that went beyond casual gardening interest. Some visitors spoke to Margaret in scientific terminology, and Emma had overheard conversations that seemed to involve more than plant exchanges. The farm's location in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom was significant for anyone interested in plant conservation history. The region had remained relatively undeveloped while other parts of New England had been transformed by suburban expansion and industrial development. Many of America's early conservationists had lived in Vermont, and the area's botanical diversity had been documented by researchers since the early 19th century. Margaret herself had been an enigmatic figure whose background seemed more complex than a typical schoolteacher's. Born in 1932, she had graduated from Vassar College in 1954 with a degree in botany. She spoke fluent Latin, essential for botanical classification, French and German, and claimed to have traveled extensively in Europe during the 1950s, though she was always vague about the specific nature of her work there. She had never married, had no children, and rarely spoke about her past in any detail. Emma's childhood memories of Margaret included impressions of a woman who seemed to know more about the world's plants than she revealed through normal conversation. Margaret could discuss the details of South American ecosystems, the intricacies of Asian medicinal plants, and the characteristics of European alpine species with an expertise that seemed to come from personal experience rather than just reading. She had a habit of receiving packages containing soil samples and seed specimens from around the world and maintaining correspondence with people whose names and affiliations she never explained to family members. Wildflower Haven's plant collection reflected Margaret's international connections and mysterious expertise. The gardens contained species from over a dozen countries, including specimens that weren't available through normal horticultural trade channels. Margaret had somehow acquired seeds and cuttings of protected species, historical varieties, and plants that other gardeners couldn't obtain. Emma had always been fascinated by Margaret's ability to authenticate plant specimens and propagate species that stumped other experts. Margaret could examine a plant and immediately identify its genus, species, and likely origin using methods that seemed to combine academic knowledge with practical experience that she never fully explained. She had helped several university researchers authenticate historical specimens, and her opinions were respected by botanists and conservationists throughout New England. When Margaret passed away unexpectedly at age 92 in March 2024, Emma was completing a major research project on endangered prairie species and preparing to accept a prestigious conservation award. Margaret's death had been sudden, a stroke, while she was working alone in her greenhouse on a Sunday evening. Emma's parents had received the call from Margaret's attorney, James Richardson, who informed them that Margaret had left detailed instructions for her funeral arrangements and the disposition of her estate. The reading of Margaret's will had taken place in Richardson's law office in Burlington, with Emma and her parents as the only attendees. Richardson, who had been Margaret's attorney for over 30 years, explained that Margaret had been very specific about her wishes for the farm and its contents. Emma had expected Margaret to leave the property to a conservation organization or university given her lack of children and her passion for plant preservation. Instead, Margaret had left everything to Emma: the 80-acre property, all structures, the entire plant collection, and what the will described as all contents, known and unknown, of the premises known as Wildflower Haven. The will also included a letter addressed specifically to Emma, written in Margaret's careful handwriting and sealed in an envelope that Richardson had been instructed to give to Emma after the formal reading. Margaret's letter had been brief, but intriguing. "Emma, you have the knowledge and instincts necessary to understand the true value of what I am leaving to you. The farm is only the beginning. Look for what others have missed, and trust your expertise to guide you to discoveries that will honor the memory of those who worked in silence to preserve the diversity of life. The most important plants are not always in the gardens where people expect to find them. The inheritance had been substantial and complicated. The Vermont property alone was appraised at $1.2 million, reflecting the premium prices for undeveloped land in scenic areas with conservation value. The plant collection had been professionally appraised at $350,000, though Emma suspected that Margaret's collection of rare and unusual species might be worth considerably more than the conservative appraisal suggested. But the inheritance also came with significant responsibilities and costs. The property required expensive maintenance and updates to meet current environmental regulations. Margaret had left behind modest debts totaling $45,000, mostly to plant suppliers and conservation organizations around the world. The property taxes on an 80-acre Vermont estate were substantial, and Emma would need to generate sufficient income from the farm to cover ongoing expenses while continuing her research career. Emma had spent the month of April 2024 taking a leave of absence from Cornell to settle Margaret's affairs and learn the practical aspects of managing Wildflower Haven. She had moved into Margaret's small but comfortable farmhouse, surrounded by her great-aunt's personal library and collection of artifacts from around the world. Pressed plants from Russia, botanical prints from Germany, dried specimens from Brazil, and photographs of Margaret with people Emma didn't recognize in landscapes Emma couldn't identify. The farm had continued to operate during the transition, with Emma learning to maintain Margaret's rare plant collection while gradually understanding the complex systems her great-aunt had used to organize and manage her botanical treasures. Margaret had never used a computer system to track plants, relying instead on an intricate catalog system and her own remarkable memory. Plants were organized according to Margaret's personal system that combined scientific classification with what she called ecological significance in ways that made perfect sense to Margaret, but were bewildering to anyone else. Emma's academic background had proved invaluable in understanding Margaret's organizational philosophy. The gardens were essentially organized like a living research collection with related species grouped together, regardless of their commercial value or visual appeal. Medicinal plants were grouped with their wild relatives and historical varieties that shared similar properties. Endangered species were carefully positioned in habitats that matched their native growing conditions rather than in showy displays. The farm's visitor base had remained loyal during the transition, though many of Margaret's longtime contacts had expressed concern about whether Emma would maintain her great-aunt's standards for authenticity and preservation. These visitors included university professors who relied on Margaret to locate obscure plant varieties, conservation specialists who appreciated her knowledge of endangered species, and international researchers who valued her ability to propagate rare specimens from their home countries. Emma had been surprised to discover that many of Margaret's visitors seemed to know more about the farm's plant collection than she did. Despite her intensive efforts to understand Margaret's cataloging system, visitors would request specific plants or species and direct Emma to areas where Margaret usually kept certain types of specimens. Some visitors seemed to have standing arrangements with Margaret for particular types of plants or seeds, though Emma found no written records of these arrangements. The financial reality of operating Wildflower Haven was both challenging and encouraging. The farm generated modest revenue from plant sales, educational programs, and occasional consultation fees, but the profit margins were slim and the business required constant attention to maintenance, propagation, and visitor services. Emma had calculated that she would need to increase revenue by at least 40% to cover all expenses, while paying herself a modest salary. Emma's expertise in plant conservation had helped her understand why Wildflower Haven attracted such a sophisticated and specialized clientele. The farm's collection included species that weren't available in most botanical gardens or commercial nurseries: endangered wildflowers, historical varieties, rare medicinal plants, and specimens that had limited commercial distribution. Margaret had somehow maintained relationships with suppliers who could provide access to plant material that normal botanists couldn't obtain. The farm's location in Vermont provided access to visitors from conservation organizations, academic institutions, and international research groups who had specific needs for rare or historical plant material. Emma had begun to realize that Wildflower Haven served as more than just a farm. It was a resource for researchers, conservationists, and international visitors who needed access to specialized plant material that wasn't readily available through normal channels. As Emma settled into her new role as owner of Wildflower Haven, she felt the weight of continuing Margaret's legacy while pursuing her own academic and professional goals. The farm represented both financial security and a connection to the mysterious woman who had shaped Emma's love of plants and conservation. But Emma was beginning to suspect that Margaret had left her more than just a farm. She had inherited a puzzle that would require all of her expertise in plant identification and conservation. History to solve. The property itself seemed to hold secrets that Emma was only beginning to discover. The old barn contained hundreds of additional plant specimens stored in specialized conditions, many of them preserved in ways that weren't represented in the main garden inventory. The greenhouse complex housed Margaret's collection of rare seeds and propagation materials, some of which Emma couldn't find in any published catalog or botanical reference. The farmhouse where Emma now lived was filled with Margaret's personal library and mysterious mementos from travels that Margaret had never fully described. Emma Reynolds, Ph.D. in conservation biology and accidental farm owner, stood at the beginning of an investigation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her great-aunt, her inheritance, and the true purpose of Wildflower Haven. Her expertise in conservation history, plant identification, and ecological relationships would prove essential as she began to uncover secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for over 60 years. The stage was set for Emma to discover that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the opportunity to uncover truths that can change everything you thought you knew about the world around you. Margaret's cryptic letter had hinted at discoveries waiting to be made, and Emma's unique combination of academic expertise and practical experience with rare plants and historical specimens had prepared her to recognize the significance of whatever secrets Wildflower Haven might contain. As May arrived in Vermont, Emma began to notice details about the farm that she had overlooked during her childhood visits and her first month as owner. There were subtle inconsistencies in the property's layout that suggested the landscape had been modified over the years. There were gaps in Margaret's carefully organized catalog that seemed to indicate missing materials or collections that had been stored elsewhere. Emma's investigation into her inheritance was about to begin in earnest, driven by her growing conviction that Margaret had left her clues to discoveries that would honor the memory of people who had worked in silence to preserve the diversity of life. The most important plants, Margaret had written, were not always in the gardens where people expect to find them. The first sign that something was amiss at Wildflower Haven came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in mid-May when Emma was conducting a systematic inventory of Margaret's seed collection in the main greenhouse. She had been working methodically through Margaret's catalog system, cross-referencing each entry with the actual seeds in storage, when she discovered that a significant number of valuable specimens were simply missing from their designated locations. Emma had approached the inventory process with the same methodical precision she used for her doctoral research. Each morning, she would select a section of Margaret's catalog and spend several hours locating the corresponding seed samples, checking their viability, and updating her digital database with current conservation status. The process was tedious but necessary. Emma needed to understand exactly what she had inherited, before she could make informed decisions about the farm's future operations. The missing seeds weren't random varieties that might have been sold or used during the transition after Margaret's death. They were specific high-value specimens that Margaret had carefully cataloged and that represented some of the most important pieces in the farm's collection. Among the missing items was a set of heirloom apple seeds from varieties thought to be extinct since the 1920s, valued by agricultural historians at approximately $25,000. Also missing was a collection of rare, medicinal plant seeds from the Amazon region worth at least $18,000, and a complete set of native prairie grasses that Margaret had somehow obtained from protected lands. She had never explained to Emma. The prairie grass collection was particularly significant because some varieties weren't supposed to exist outside of university research facilities. The seeds covered species from the Great Plains that had been classified as critically endangered, and as far as Emma knew, had never been officially released for private ownership. Margaret's possession of these materials had always puzzled Emma, but she had assumed that her great-aunt had acquired them through the same mysterious networks that allowed her to obtain other rare botanical specimens. Emma's initial assumption was that Margaret might have moved these valuable items to a more secure location before her death, perhaps anticipating that the farm would change hands and wanting to protect the most valuable inventory from theft or damage during the transition. It would have been characteristic of Margaret's careful nature to safeguard the farm's most precious items. But as Emma's investigation continued over the next several days, she discovered that the missing seeds followed a very specific and troubling pattern. Every missing item related to plants that were either historically significant or critically endangered. Seeds from common varieties, even those worth significantly more money, remained exactly where Margaret's catalog indicated they should be. A collection of rare Japanese ornamental seeds worth $30,000 sat in its designated location, as did a set of prize-winning orchid seeds valued at $22,000. But every seed related to endangered Native American species had vanished. The pattern was so consistent and comprehensive that Emma began to suspect it wasn't accidental or the result of Margaret's precautionary measures. Someone with extensive knowledge of Margaret's inventory system had systematically removed specific seeds, leaving behind items of equal or greater commercial value, but taking only those related to endangered native species. The removal had been done carefully and professionally, with catalog cards updated to show that the seeds had been relocated rather than used, but with no indication of where they had been moved or who had authorized the transfers. Emma's expertise in plant conservation made her uniquely qualified to recognize the significance of the missing items. The absent seeds weren't just valuable collectibles sought after by wealthy gardeners. They represented a comprehensive collection of endangered American plant genetics that would be invaluable to researchers, conservationists, or anyone seeking to understand the ecological history of North America and preserve species that were rapidly disappearing from the wild. Margaret had assembled what amounted to a private seed bank over the course of 4 decades. The collection had included not only commercially available seeds, but also historical varieties, endangered species, and propagation materials that weren't widely available to the public. The missing materials represented decades of careful acquisition and constituted a resource that would be extremely difficult to replace. Emma calculated that the missing conservation-related seeds had a combined value of over $250,000 based on current market prices for rare botanical specimens. But their research value was far greater than their monetary worth. The missing collection represented one of the most comprehensive private libraries of American plant genetics that Emma had ever encountered, and its systematic removal suggested that someone understood its true significance. The discovery of the missing seeds prompted Emma to conduct a more thorough examination of the entire property. Using the systematic approach she had learned during her academic training, she began surveying the land and comparing the landscape. to the property's official maps, which she had obtained from the Vermont Land Registry as part of her efforts to understand the property she had inherited. What Emma discovered through her careful measurements was deeply troubling and completely unexpected. There were significant discrepancies between the official property maps and the actual layout of the farm. Discrepancies that suggested substantial modifications had been made to the original landscape without being reflected in the public records. The most obvious discrepancy was in the northeastern section of the property where the main growing fields were located. According to the official maps filed with Vermont authorities, the property contained a natural depression that formed a seasonal pond covering approximately 1 acre. But when Emma carefully surveyed the area, she found that the pond was significantly smaller than indicated on the maps, and its location had been shifted by about 100 yards from where it should have been. The missing area, about 3/4 of an acre, wasn't accounted for by natural changes like erosion or water movement. Emma had carefully measured around all visible landscape features, and her calculations indicated that there was substantial space that existed according to the property maps, but had been modified in ways that disguised its original configuration. The modified area appeared to be located beneath what looked like a natural ridge in an area where Margaret had planted an extensive collection of native woodland plants. The ridge was an impressive natural feature that appeared to be part of the original landscape. It extended about 150 feet and was covered with mature native trees and understory plants that matched the surrounding forest. The ridge had always been one of Emma's favorite features of the property, and she had never questioned its placement or formation. But Emma's measurements revealed that the ridge was in a location that should have been part of the seasonal pond, according to the original property maps. Emma's investigation revealed similar discrepancies in other parts of the property. A section of the southern boundary that should have contained a straight line of stone walls, according to historical maps, now featured a series of gentle curves and natural-looking outcroppings. A wooded area on the western edge that should have covered about 5 acres, according to the official maps, actually measured closer to 6 acres, with the additional space concealed by clever landscaping that made the forest edge appear natural and undisturbed. The landscape inconsistencies weren't immediately obvious to casual observation, which suggested that whoever had designed and implemented the modifications had considerable expertise in disguising structural changes to natural environments. Margaret had been remarkably clever about concealing the alterations to the property's original layout. The modified features appeared to be natural elements that added character and beauty to the historic farm. The discrepancies weren't noticeable unless someone was specifically looking for inconsistencies between the official maps and the actual landscape. Emma's academic background in ecological history provided crucial context for understanding what she was discovering. During the mid-20th century, it had been common for conservation organizations and their supporters to modify landscapes to create secure habitats, seed preservation areas, or hidden growing spaces. The techniques for concealing modified landscapes had been refined by professionals who understood how to make changes that wouldn't be detected by casual inspection, routine land surveys, or even professional environmental assessments. Conservation organizations had developed sophisticated methods for creating hidden growing spaces that could be used to propagate endangered species, store sensitive plant materials, or house valuable seed collections. These modifications were typically made to appear as natural landscape features, and they were designed to be accessible only to people who knew the specific locations and methods for finding concealed entrances or access points. Emma had studied numerous historical examples of such modifications during her research into conservation history. Private estates, botanical gardens, and other facilities used by plant preservation groups routinely included hidden growing spaces, concealed storage areas, and disguised propagation facilities that allowed for secure operations and protection from potential thieves or competitors. The landscape modifications Emma was discovering at Wildflower Haven were consistent with the professional standards and techniques that had been used by conservation organizations for decades. The more Emma investigated, the more convinced she became that Margaret had deliberately concealed substantial, growing spaces within the property for purposes that weren't apparent from the farm's normal operations. The missing seeds, the landscape discrepancies, and Margaret's mysterious background were beginning to form a pattern that suggested Wildflower Haven had served purposes far beyond growing plants for a rural Vermont farm. Emma's suspicions were reinforced when she began examining Margaret's business records more carefully, applying the same analytical skills she used for her academic research to understand the financial operations of the farm. Margaret had maintained meticulous financial records, detailed ledgers documenting every transaction, expense, and source of income. But Emma discovered significant gaps and inconsistencies in the documentation that didn't make sense for someone as organized and careful as Margaret had been throughout her life. The farm's recorded income, as documented in Margaret's carefully maintained books, wasn't sufficient to cover the property's substantial expenses, Margaret's comfortable lifestyle, and her frequent international travel. Emma calculated that the farm's documented sales revenue would have covered perhaps 50% of Margaret's known expenses, leaving a substantial gap that had to have been filled by additional sources of income that weren't reflected in the farm's official records. Margaret's personal tax returns, found in a locked filing cabinet in the farmhouse office, showed income levels that were significantly higher than what the farm's cash receipts and sales records could account for. Margaret had consistently reported income to the IRS that was 50 to 60% higher than what the farm's documented sales could justify. The discrepancy suggested that Margaret had been receiving substantial money from sources other than plant sales, but there was no documentation in the farm's records to explain these additional income streams. Emma also discovered that Margaret had maintained several bank accounts that weren't used for the farm's routine operations. These accounts, which Emma found references to in Margaret's personal papers, had received regular deposits from sources that were identified only by numeric codes rather than organization names or individual identities. The deposits had continued for decades, with amounts that varied considerably but averaged several $1,000 per month and totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. The pattern of deposits was particularly intriguing to Emma because of her extensive knowledge of how conservation organizations had historically funded their operations and maintained relationships with private landowners and preservation specialists. During the mid-20th century, major conservation groups had routinely made payments to property owners, researchers, and support personnel through foundations, numbered accounts, and other mechanisms designed to obscure the source of funding and protect the identities of people who were working with sensitive species or habitats. The payment patterns in Margaret's bank records were remarkably consistent with the methods that conservation organizations had used to fund long-term operations or maintain relationships with valuable partners. The regularity of the payments, the use of coded identifiers instead of organization names, and the substantial amounts involved all suggested a professional arrangement rather than casual business relationships or investment income. Emma's investigation into Margaret's background revealed additional mysteries that deepened her suspicions about her great-aunt's true activities and the real purpose of Wildflower Haven. Margaret's passport, which Emma found in a safety deposit box along with other important documents, showed extensive international travel that wasn't consistent with the schedule or financial resources of someone running a small rural farm. Margaret had made multiple trips to Europe, South America, and Asia over the course of 4 decades, often staying abroad for several weeks at a time, and sometimes making multiple trips to the same countries within a single year. The travel patterns were particularly heavy during the 1960s and 1970s. when environmental awareness was just beginning and conservation activities were most urgent due to rapid development. The passport stamps revealed that Margaret had visited countries that were strategically significant in plant conservation and biodiversity protection. She had made frequent trips to Brazil during the height of Amazon deforestation when crucial. Medicinal plants and undocumented species were being lost at unprecedented rates. She had visited China repeatedly during the 1980s when the country was just beginning to open to Western researchers and when ancient Chinese medicinal plant knowledge was at risk of being lost to modernization. Margaret's travel history also included visits to several countries in Southeast Asia during periods of political upheaval and rapid development, trips to European countries where historical plant varieties were being preserved, and journeys to remote islands where unique plant species existed nowhere else on Earth. Margaret's travel itinerary read like a map of global biodiversity hotspots, and the timing of her trips often coincided with major environmental challenges or significant conservation operations. Emma also discovered a substantial collection of Margaret's personal correspondence that raised additional questions about her great-aunt's connections and activities. Margaret had maintained correspondence with people around the world, many of whom used only first names or initials in their letters, and who wrote about topics that seemed to involve more than casual friendship or business relationships. The letters often contained references to mutual contacts, shared interests, and common concerns that suggested relationships based on professional collaboration or shared missions rather than personal friendship. The content of the letters frequently involved discussions about field research, efforts to obtain access to protected lands, and coordination of activities that seemed to involve multiple people working toward common goals. Some letters specifically mentioned searches for particular plant species, preservation of seed stocks, and what appeared to be code names for conservation projects. Some of Margaret's correspondents wrote in languages other than English, and the content of these letters often dealt with topics related to international conservation, botanical research, and what appeared to be ongoing projects or investigations. Emma's language skills, developed during her academic training, allowed her to translate some of the letters from German, French, and Portuguese. The translated letters revealed discussions of rare plant discoveries, research into endangered species, and coordination of efforts to preserve or share sensitive botanical materials. The correspondence suggested that Margaret had been part of an international network of people who were interested in plant conservation, biodiversity protection, and the preservation of ecological knowledge. Some letters referenced efforts to obtain plants from areas that were being developed or destroyed. Other letters discussed research into historical varieties and coordination with academics, gardeners, and other researchers who were working on similar projects. Margaret appeared to have been a key figure in a community of people who were dedicated to preserving and sharing information about plant species, conservation techniques, and historical botanical knowledge that was being lost to development and modernization. The network seemed to include former government employees, academic researchers, private landowners, and other civilians who had developed expertise in plant conservation and who worked together to gather and preserve botanical resources that were at risk. Emma's growing suspicions about Margaret's activities were reinforced when she began to pay closer attention to the farm's visitor patterns and to observe the behavior of people who visited Wildflower Haven. She noticed that certain visitors seemed to come to the farm on regular schedules, often examining specific types of plants or requesting seeds on particular topics related to endangered species, historical varieties, or botanical research. These regular visitors rarely browsed casually through the farm's general collection. Instead, they knew exactly what they wanted and often asked for specific varieties or requested plants from particular regions that related to conservation projects. They seemed familiar with Margaret's organizational system and often directed Emma to areas where Margaret usually kept materials related to their areas of interest. Their knowledge of the farm's plant collection was often more detailed than Emma's own understanding. Despite her intensive efforts to learn Margaret's cataloging system, some of these regular visitors seemed surprised and concerned by Emma's presence and asked detailed questions about Margaret's death, the circumstances of the transition, and the disposition of Margaret's estate. Several visitors specifically asked whether Margaret had left any special instructions for particular contacts, or whether there were any additional materials that weren't displayed in the main garden areas. The question suggested that these visitors knew about aspects of Margaret's operations that weren't apparent from the farm's normal activities. Emma also noticed that some visitors seemed disappointed and frustrated when they couldn't find specific plants that they expected to be available. These visitors would ask for plants or seeds by exact scientific name or even by catalog numbers, suggesting that they had detailed knowledge of Margaret's inventory system and had previously been able to obtain specific materials through the farm. When Emma couldn't locate the requested items, often because they were among the missing endangered species seeds, these visitors would often leave quickly without examining anything else, as if their visit had a specific purpose that couldn't be fulfilled by browsing the general inventory. The pattern of visitor behavior strongly suggested that Wildflower Haven had served as more than a typical farm for at least some of Margaret's contacts. The property appeared to have functioned as a source for specialized plant materials that weren't available through normal channels, and Margaret had maintained relationships with visitors who had specific needs for endangered species, historical varieties, or other materials that required special expertise to obtain and propagate. Emma's investigation was complicated by the fact that she was also trying to maintain the farm's normal operations while learning the business aspects of running a rural agricultural enterprise and continuing her professional research, the daily demands of caring for plants, managing the property, handling visitors, processing orders, and maintaining the buildings left limited time for the detailed investigation that the mysteries surrounding Margaret's activities seemed to require. But Emma's academic training had taught her to be systematic and thorough in her research, and she began to approach the investigation of Margaret's secrets with the same methodical approach she used for her conservation studies. She created detailed files documenting the missing seeds, the landscape discrepancies, the financial irregularities, and the suspicious visitor behavior. She photographed and cataloged all of Margaret's personal papers, correspondence, and business records, creating a comprehensive database that would allow her to identify patterns and connections that might not be obvious from examining individual pieces of evidence. Emma also began researching the history of the property at Wildflower Haven, hoping to find clues about when and why the landscape modifications had been made, and who might have been responsible for the professional quality work that had been required to conceal substantial growing areas within the existing terrain. The Vermont Land Registry had records showing that Margaret had applied for agricultural permits several times during her ownership of the property, but the permits had been for routine farming activities and updates rather than major landscape changes that would have required detailed environmental plans and professional oversight. However, Emma discovered that there had been significant modification work done on the property in 1962, shortly after Margaret had purchased the farm from the previous owner. The work had been performed by a landscaping company called Northwoods Environmental Services, which specialized in conservation projects and habitat restoration rather than typical residential or commercial landscaping. The permits had been approved for environmental improvements and habitat enhancements, but the specific nature of the habitat enhancements wasn't detailed in the public records. Emma's research into Northwoods Environmental Services revealed that the company had worked extensively on conservation properties, wildlife refuges, and facilities that required specialized environmental features. The firm had experience with projects that involved endangered species, sensitive habitats, and clients who required complete discretion about the nature of their work. The company's client list, to the extent that it was available in public records, included several conservation organizations, research institutions, and foundations that were known to have connections to the early environmental movement. Timing and scope of the 1962 landscape work was entirely consistent with the creation of concealed growing areas within the property. The choice of Northwood's Environmental Services suggested that the project had required expertise in habitat creation and ecological systems. Emma realized that the modifications to Margaret's property had been planned and executed by professionals who understood the requirements for creating secure hidden habitats that could pass routine inspection while serving specialized conservation purposes. The more Emma learned about Margaret's landscape modifications, financial arrangements, travel patterns, visitor relationships, and correspondence networks, the more convinced she became that her great-aunt had been involved in activities that went far beyond operating a small Vermont farm. Margaret appeared to have been part of a sophisticated network of people who were engaged in collecting, preserving, and sharing plant materials related to endangered species and historical varieties. Emma's expertise in conservation history provided the analytical framework necessary to understand what she was discovering. During the mid-20th century and continuing into the present, there had been extensive networks of academics, gardeners, researchers, and other civilians who had worked with conservation organizations in various capacities to preserve plant species that were being lost to development, agricultural standardization, and environmental degradation. Some had been formal employees or contractors of major environmental groups, while others had served as field researchers, propagation specialists, or facilitators who helped conservation organizations accomplish their missions without being directly employed by any institution. Margaret's activities seemed entirely consistent with someone who had served as what conservationists called a preservation partner, a person who provided services or resources that were valuable to conservation operations, but who wasn't a formal employee of any organization. The farm would have been an ideal cover for someone who was involved in plant preservation activities. Farms naturally attracted visitors who were interested in plants and agriculture, and they provided completely legitimate reasons for growing unusual species, corresponding with people around the world, and collecting materials that might otherwise seem suspicious. Farm owners need to travel internationally, maintain contacts with growers and customers in various countries, and handle rare or sensitive plant materials would be completely normal and wouldn't attract attention from neighbors, authorities, or anyone else who might be curious about unusual activities. As May progressed and Emma's investigation continued, she became increasingly convinced that Margaret had left her far more than just a successful farm and valuable real estate. The missing seeds, hidden growing areas, mysterious financial arrangements, and suspicious visitor behavior all pointed to the existence of secrets that Margaret had concealed within Wildflower Haven for decades. Emma's unique combination of academic expertise in conservation history and practical experience with rare plants and historical specimens had prepared her to recognize the significance of what she was discovering. The question that remained was how to find what Margaret had hidden and what Emma would do with whatever secrets she uncovered. Margaret's cryptic letter had suggested that Emma had the knowledge and instincts necessary to understand the true value of her inheritance, and had also warned that the most important plants were not always in the gardens where people expect to find them. Emma was beginning to realize that solving the mystery of Margaret's secrets would require more than just academic research and careful observation. She would need to think like a conservationist, understanding how plant materials were concealed, protected, and shared by people who had worked in what Margaret had called silence to preserve the diversity of life. The investigation was about to move from passive observation to active exploration. As Emma prepared to search for the hidden growing areas that her measurements had revealed, and to look for the missing seeds that represented the key to understanding Margaret's true activities, her expertise in plant conservation and ecological history would be essential as she began to uncover secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for over 60 years. The mystery that had begun with missing seeds was evolving into a comprehensive investigation that challenged everything Emma thought she knew about her great-aunt and her inheritance. Wildflower Haven was revealing itself to be far more than a farm, and Emma was beginning to understand that Margaret had left her clues to discoveries that would require all of her expertise and courage to pursue. Emma Reynolds approached the mysteries surrounding Margaret's farm with the same methodical precision that had made her conservation research so successful. Her academic training had taught her to test the simplest explanations first, to document every hypothesis, and to avoid jumping to dramatic conclusions without exhausting all rational possibilities. Despite the mounting evidence that something extraordinary was hidden within Wildflower Haven, Emma was determined to investigate every conventional explanation before accepting that her great-aunt had been involved in a secret conservation network. Emma's systematic approach to investigating Margaret's mysteries had been thorough and professional, but it had also been frustrating and ultimately inconclusive. Every rational explanation she had tested had proven inadequate to fully account for the evidence she had discovered. Emma was beginning to understand that solving the mystery of Margaret's secrets would require her to move beyond passive investigation and to begin actively searching for the hidden truth that Margaret had concealed within Wildflower Haven. The stage was set for Emma to take the decisive step from investigation to exploration, from hypothesis to discovery. Her expertise in plant conservation and ecological history had prepared her to recognize the significance of whatever she might find, and her systematic approach to research had provided her with the foundation necessary to understand Margaret's activities in their proper historical context. Emma was about to discover that sometimes the most important answers can only be found by having the courage to look in places where others fear to search, and that the most valuable secrets are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and determination to uncover them. Emma's systematic investigation of rational explanations had reached its limits, but her academic training demanded professional validation before proceeding with more invasive exploration. She needed expert confirmation that her discoveries warranted the dramatic step of actively searching for hidden areas within the property. Her first call was to Dr. Amanda Foster, a geocologist at the University of Vermont who specialized in landscape assessment and had extensive experience working with conservation organizations on sensitive projects. Dr. Foster arrived at Wildflower Haven on a clear June morning, bringing sophisticated ground-penetrating radar equipment and a graduate student assistant named David Park. Emma had explained her discoveries in general terms, emphasizing the landscape discrepancies and her need for professional confirmation of the hidden areas before proceeding with any exploration. "Ms. Reynolds, what you're describing is definitely worth investigating," Dr. Foster said as she examined Emma's measurements and map comparisons. These types of landscape modifications were common during the conservation movement of the 1960s, and the professional quality of the work suggests that whoever planned these concealed areas had significant expertise and resources. Dr. Foster's ground-penetrating radar survey confirmed Emma's measurements with shocking precision. The equipment revealed not only the concealed areas that Emma had calculated, but also additional details about their construction and contents. The hidden areas contained what appeared to be underground structures, growing chambers, and substantial amounts of material that showed up as dense, organized masses on the radar display. "These aren't empty storage spaces," Dr. Foster explained as she reviewed the radar data. "There are definitely substantial contents in these concealed areas. The organization suggests careful planning rather than random storage. The spaces appear to be climate-controlled and professionally constructed, which indicates significant investment and long-term planning. Most significantly, Dr. Foster's equipment detected what appeared to be a sophisticated access mechanism built into the ridge on the northeastern section of the property. The radar showed a complex system involving reinforced passageways, hinges, and what looked like an electronic or mechanical opening mechanism that would allow access to the underground spaces. "This is remarkable engineering," Dr. Foster told Emma. "Whoever designed this access system understood both security and ecological integration. The mechanism is built to blend perfectly with the natural landscape while still allowing access. And there are backup systems that would allow entry if the main mechanism failed." Dr. Foster's validation gave Emma the professional confirmation she needed to proceed with active exploration, but it also raised new questions about the legal and ethical implications of what she might discover. Dr. Foster recommended that Emma contact conservation authorities before attempting to access the hidden areas, particularly given the possibility that they might contain endangered species or other protected materials. Emma's decision to contact conservation authorities proved to be both wise and transformative. Her call to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was transferred to Agent Sarah Rodriguez, who specialized in endangered species protection and had extensive experience with cases involving rare plants discovered in private hands. Agent Rodriguez arrived at Wildflower Haven within days of Emma's call, accompanied by a botanical specialist who carried equipment that made Dr. Foster's ground-penetrating radar look primitive. Agent Rodriguez explained that the USFWs maintained a specialized unit that dealt with discoveries of rare or endangered plant species, and that Emma's description of Margaret's activities had triggered protocols for investigating potential conservation-related materials. "Ms. Reynolds, based on what you've described, there's a strong possibility that your great-aunt was involved in what we call heritage preservation activities related to endangered species," Agent Rodriguez explained. During the 1960s and 70s, there were numerous unofficial arrangements between conservation organizations and private landowners who helped preserve important plant species that might otherwise have been lost to development or agricultural standardization. Agent Rodriguez's technical specialist, Dr. Michael Torres, conducted a more sophisticated survey of the hidden areas using equipment that could penetrate deeper into the concealed spaces and provide detailed analysis of their contents. What he discovered exceeded everyone's expectations. "We're looking at 3 separate concealed growing areas, each with different purposes and different types of contents," Dr. Torres reported. "The first area appears to contain an underground seed bank with thousands of specimens organized in professional storage systems. The second area contains what looks like propagation equipment and growing chambers with artificial lighting. The third area appears to be a documentation center with specialized equipment for recording and preserving botanical information." Most remarkably, Dr. Torres's equipment detected clear signatures of rare metal containers and specialized preservation systems within the first hidden area. The metallic signatures were consistent with cryogenic storage, and the organized arrangement suggested seed vaults or other valuable items that had been carefully stored and cataloged. "Ms. Reynolds, we need to proceed very carefully here," Agent Rodriguez told Emma. "What we're detecting suggests that your great-aunt may have been involved in preserving not only common plants, but also critically endangered species that were protected by federal law. This could include species that were thought to be extinct in the wild, historical varieties with significant genetic importance, or other botanical resources that were maintained outside normal conservation channels." Agent Rodriguez explained that the USFWS would need to coordinate with other agencies, including the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Park Service, before attempting to access the concealed areas. The potential presence of endangered species and valuable plant genetics required specialized handling procedures and preservation protocols that went beyond normal law enforcement activities. While waiting for federal agencies to coordinate their approach, Emma used her academic expertise to research Margaret's activities within the broader context of conservation history. Her investigation into historical records and conservation archives revealed that Margaret's pattern of activities was consistent with a highly secretive program called Operation Seed Keeper that had been conducted by a coalition of conservation organizations from 1958 to 1985. Operation Seed Keeper had been designed to create a network of civilian assets who could preserve, propagate, and distribute endangered plant species that needed to be kept outside official government facilities to ensure their survival. The operation had involved farm owners, botanists, university professors, and other civilians who had access to land and the expertise necessary to understand the significance of plant preservation. Emma discovered references to Operation Seed Keeper in congressional testimony from the 1990s environmental protection hearings, but most details of the operation remained classified due to ongoing protection of endangered species locations. However, the declassified portions of the testimony revealed that the operation had been considered one of conservation's most successful long-term plant preservation programs, and that it had involved substantial financial resources and sophisticated operational security. The historical research also revealed that many Operation Seed Keeper participants had been provided with secure growing facilities, propagation systems, and financial support that allowed them to maintain their cover activities while serving conservation functions. The participants had been trained in botanical preservation, secure growing procedures, and methods for transferring sensitive plant materials without detection. Emma's research into Margaret's travel patterns and correspondence revealed that her great-aunt's activities matched the operational profile of a senior seed keeper participant. Margaret's trips to biodiversity hotspots, her contacts with international researchers, and her access to rare plant specimens all suggested that she had been part of a sophisticated network designed to preserve endangered species and maintain relationships with other conservationists and botanical experts around the world. Most significantly, Emma discovered that Operation Seed Keeper participants had been provided with substantial resources for acquiring and preserving valuable materials that might be needed for future conservation efforts. The operation had involved not only plants but also specialized equipment, preservation technologies, and other resources that could be used to support conservation activities or to compensate researchers and collectors who had provided valuable specimens. The federal investigation of Wildflower Haven became a major interagency operation involving the USFWS, Department of Agriculture, Environmental Protection Agency, and several leading conservation organizations. Agent Rodriguez coordinated a team of specialists who brought sophisticated equipment and extensive experience with historical conservation discoveries. The team included Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Nature Conservancy's Rare Plant Recovery Program, Agriculture Department Specialist Michael Chang, who specialized in heirloom crop preservation, and Botanical Gardens Director Dr. Robert Kim, who was expert in authentication and preservation of endangered plant species. The investigation was conducted under strict security protocols with the farm closed to the public and the surrounding area monitored by federal conservation personnel. The team's initial survey revealed that the concealed areas were even more sophisticated than previous investigations had suggested. The hidden growing spaces included climate control systems, irrigation equipment, artificial lighting, and security systems that had been maintained and updated over decades of operation. The construction quality and technical sophistication indicated that the facilities had been designed and built with unlimited resources and professional expertise. Ms. Reynolds, what your great-aunt created here represents one of the most sophisticated private conservation facilities we've ever encountered, Dr. Walsh explained. The level of security, the quality of the growing systems, and the scope of the materials suggest that this facility was designed to serve as a critical backup for important plant species that couldn't be stored in official government facilities. The federal team's investigation also revealed that Wildflower Haven had been equipped with sophisticated documentation systems that had allowed Margaret to maintain records on endangered species and other seedkeeper participants around the world. The documentation equipment was hidden within what appeared to be normal farm fixtures and had been regularly updated with the latest preservation and recording technology. Most remarkably, the investigation revealed that Margaret had been operating under the direct supervision of a Nature Conservancy officer who used the cover identity Mr. Harrison, the same mysterious figure who had supervised the 1962 landscape work. Mr. Harrison's real identity was revealed to be Nature Conservancy senior botanist Thomas Blackwood, who had managed the seedkeeper operation for over 20 years and had been responsible for Margaret's recruitment and training. The discovery that Margaret had been a key participant in a major conservation operation transformed Emma's situation from a personal inheritance matter into a case of significant environmental importance. The federal investigation expanded to include botanical experts, seed bank specialists, and senior officials from multiple conservation organizations. Conservation Officer Blackwood, now retired but called back as a consultant, met with Emma to explain Margaret's role in Operation Seedkeeper and the significance of the materials that had been preserved at Wildflower Haven. The meeting took place in a secure facility at the Nature Conservancy's Vermont headquarters, with Emma accompanied by her attorney and federal conservation personnel. Ms. Reynolds, your great-aunt was one of our most valuable and trusted participants for nearly 30 years, Officer Blackwood explained. Margaret volunteered for Operation Seedkeeper in 1958 after her brother, your grandfather, discovered a rare prairie grass species that was bulldozed for a shopping mall development. She wanted to honor his discovery by helping to preserve the plant diversity that was rapidly being lost to development. Blackwood revealed that Margaret had been extensively trained in conservation procedures, botanical authentication, secure propagation, and environmental protection. She had been provided with substantial financial resources and had been authorized to acquire and preserve plant materials that were critical to ongoing conservation operations, but that couldn't be stored in official facilities for security or political reasons. Wildflower Haven was designed to serve as a backup preservation facility for species that were too endangered or too valuable to be stored in normal conservation facilities, Blackwood continued. Margaret was responsible for maintaining plants related to species that might be needed for future restoration, for preserving resources that could be used to support ongoing conservation missions, and for maintaining relationships with researchers and collectors who might provide valuable specimens or assistance. Most significantly, Blackwood revealed that Margaret had been authorized to preserve substantial plant resources that had been set aside for conservation operations that might be needed in the future. These resources included rare seeds, historical varieties, and other valuable materials that could be used to restore ecosystems or reintroduce species without relying on institutional funding that could be detected by development interests or political opponents. The federal investigation team worked for 2 weeks to develop preservation protocols for accessing the concealed areas without compromising the integrity of the materials or exposing endangered species to contamination. The operation involved extensive planning, specialized equipment, and coordination between multiple agencies that rarely work together on such projects. On a warm morning in late June, Emma watched as federal specialists prepared to access the hidden area behind the northeastern ridge. The operation was conducted with the precision of a scientific expedition, with each team member assigned specific responsibilities and conservation protocols that ensured complete control over the discovery process. Dr. Torres located the access mechanism built into the ridge and activated the system, using codes that had been found in Margaret's personal papers. A section of the seemingly natural ridge, weighing several tons with its covering of native plants, silently pivoted away from the hillside on precisely engineered hinges, revealing a doorway that led into Margaret's secret world. The hidden chamber was larger than anyone had expected, extending nearly 50 feet into the hillside that officially didn't exist. The room was lined with specialized growing shelves, climate control systems, and preservation equipment that represented decades of careful planning and substantial financial investment. The air was perfectly regulated for temperature and humidity, and the lighting system mimicked natural sunlight through a sophisticated array of full-spectrum bulbs. But what immediately caught everyone's attention was a large vault built into the far wall of the hidden growing chamber. The vault was a professional-grade preservation installation that would have been appropriate for a major botanical garden or government facility, and it was equipped with multiple locking systems and security features that indicated extremely valuable contents. Emma's first glimpse into Margaret's secret world was overwhelming. The hidden chamber contained thousands of plants organized in professional growing systems, with detailed cataloging systems that indicated precise organization and regular maintenance. The plants appeared to span decades of conservation efforts, with specimens in various stages of growth and from various regions and ecosystems. Ms. Reynolds, this represents one of the most comprehensive private plant conservation facilities ever discovered, Dr. Walsh told Emma as the team began their preliminary examination of the chamber's contents. Your great-aunt appears to have preserved species related to major ecosystems spanning decades of American conservation history. The team's initial survey revealed plants related to ecosystems in the Great Plains, Appalachian forests, coastal wetlands, and desert regions. The materials included growing specimens, preservation chambers, seed stocks, and documentation that provided unprecedented insight into conservation activities that had been conducted for decades. Many of the plants bore identification markings that indicated their extreme rarity and historical importance. The opening of Margaret's vault required specialized equipment and techniques that took federal specialists several hours to complete safely. When the massive vault door finally swung open, Emma found herself looking at a treasure that exceeded her wildest imagination and validated every aspect of her investigation into Margaret's mysterious activities. The vault contained row upon row of seeds organized with the same meticulous care that Margaret had applied to her plant collection. Seeds from prairie ecosystems that had been almost completely destroyed filled multiple shelves, each seed sample carefully cataloged with collection dates and location references. Specimens from old-growth forests, wetland systems, and desert habitats were organized in professional storage systems with detailed documentation of their origins and significance. But the vault's contents went far beyond seeds. Plant genetic material from dozens of ecosystems was stored in climate-controlled containers, representing biodiversity that had been preserved for future restoration efforts. Rare bulbs and rootstocks filled secure storage boxes, each item documented with photographs and provenance information that indicated its acquisition through conservation operations. Dr. Kim conducted a preliminary valuation of the vault's contents and announced that the materials had a scientific value that was practically incalculable. The seed bank alone contained viable specimens of at least 30 plant species that had been officially declared extinct in the wild. The genetic materials included varieties that had disappeared from their native ranges decades ago. The combined scientific and ecological value of the collection was estimated at over $75 million. Ms. Reynolds, these materials represent conservation resources that were preserved for future ecosystem restoration that might require resources outside normal institutional channels, Officer Blackwood explained as the team cataloged the vault's contents. Your great-aunt was responsible for maintaining these resources and ensuring they would be available for future operations or for supporting conservation efforts that had lost funding or political support. But the most remarkable discovery came when Dr. Walsh opened a series of sealed containers that contained what appeared to be historical documents of extraordinary significance. The containers held original documentation of major conservation operations, including materials related to the first Earth Day, the creation of the Endangered Species Act, and numerous other critical events in environmental history. Among the most valuable documents were complete files related to Operation Seedkeeper itself, including lists of participants, operational procedures, and financial records that provided comprehensive documentation of one of conservation's most successful long-term operations. The files revealed that Margaret had been one of over 250 civilians worldwide who had participated in the operation, and that the network had preserved materials and resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Most significantly for Emma, the documents included detailed records of Margaret's activities and accomplishments as a Seedkeeper participant. Margaret had been responsible for preserving plants related to over 120 different endangered ecosystems, had maintained secure communications with researchers and collectors in 38 countries, and had been personally commended by 5 different conservation directors for her exceptional service to environmental protection. Yet the greatest surprise was still to come. As Emma examined a weathered leather journal found in Margaret's vault, she discovered a series of entries dating back to 1960 that detailed the true identity of the farm's previous owner, Edith Crawford. According to Margaret's careful documentation, supported by newspaper clippings, legal papers, and private correspondence, Edith Crawford was actually Caroline Harrison, the missing heiress to the Harrison shipping fortune who had vanished without a trace in 1958. The journal revealed that Caroline Harrison had abandoned her wealthy family and privileged life after discovering that her father's shipping company was knowingly transporting toxic chemicals that were destroying natural habitats. Unwilling to remain part of a family that prioritized profits over environmental protection, Caroline had changed her identity and purchased the Vermont farm, where she had begun collecting and preserving native plant species threatened by development and industrialization. When Caroline's health began to fail in 1960, she had sought out someone who would continue her preservation work. She had found Margaret through mutual conservation contacts and had sold her the farm for a nominal sum after confirming that Margaret shared her commitment to plant preservation. The sale had included not only the property but also Caroline's entire collection of rare seeds and plants, along with detailed records of her conservation efforts. Most remarkably, the journal included a legal document signed by Caroline Harrison stating that should her true identity ever be discovered, she wished for her personal fortune, held in trust since her disappearance, to be dedicated to establishing a permanent conservation foundation to continue the work she had begun. The document included bank account numbers, trust fund details, and legal contacts who could verify Caroline's identity and execute her wishes. Margaret's journal explained that she had honored Caroline's request for anonymity during her lifetime, but had preserved the documentation so that Caroline's legacy could eventually be recognized and her fortune used for the environmental protection she had valued more than wealth or social position. Emma had not only inherited a remarkable conservation facility, but also discovered the solution to one of the most famous missing persons cases of the 20th century. The federal government's response to Emma's discovery was swift and supportive. Within weeks of the vault's opening, Emma found herself in discussions with multiple conservation agencies about the disposition of the materials and her role in their future preservation. The discussions were conducted by a team of environmental attorneys who had extensive experience with similar cases involving private discoveries of conservation resources. Under federal environmental law and established precedents for civilian discoveries of endangered species, Emma had certain responsibilities for the proper care of protected species, but also rights to recognition and support for her role in preserving them. The conservation organization's initial proposal included substantial funding for maintaining wildflower, Haven as an official satellite facility of the National Plant Conservation Network, with Emma serving as its director. But Emma's negotiations were complicated by her desire to honor both Margaret's legacy and Caroline Harrison's original vision. Emma insisted that any agreement include provisions for acknowledging both women's contributions to conservation, establishing educational programs about civilian contributions to species preservation, and creating systems for ongoing research into Operation Seedkeeper and similar programs. The final agreement transformed Wildflower Haven into the Reynolds Conservation Center, with $28 million in funding from the Harrison Trust that Caroline had established before her disappearance. The center would serve as both a working conservation facility and a living museum dedicated to the history of civilian plant preservation efforts. Emma was appointed executive director with a substantial salary and the authority to continue both the preservation work and her own research. The Harrison family, finally learning the truth about Caroline's disappearance after more than 60 years, honored her wishes regarding her fortune. The Harrison Shipping Company, now run by Caroline's great-nephew, who had transformed it into an environmentally responsible corporation, established an additional $45 million endowment to support the center's ongoing operations and expansion. Emma's financial transformation was dramatic, but not as significant as the changes in her understanding of conservation history and her own place in the environmental legacy. She learned that her grandfather's discovery of a rare prairie grass had indeed been bulldozed for a shopping mall, and that Margaret's recruitment for Operation Seedkeeper had been motivated by her desire to honor his work and continue his commitment to plant preservation. The discovery also transformed Emma's academic career. Her research into civilian conservation networks was expanded to include her discoveries at Wildflower Haven. Resulting work was immediately recognized as a groundbreaking contribution to environmental history. Emma was offered academic positions at Harvard, Yale, and Cornell, along with opportunities to work with government agencies on historical preservation projects. Most importantly, Emma's discovery led to the declassification and public release of substantial information about Operation Seedkeeper and similar programs that had involved civilian contributions to conservation efforts. The revelations provided new understanding of how environmental organizations had worked with private citizens to preserve important species and ecosystems, and they honored the memory of hundreds of Americans who had served their country's natural heritage in roles that had never been publicly recognized. 6 months after the discovery, Emma Reynolds stood in the renovated Wildflower Haven, which had been transformed into both a working conservation center and a memorial to Margaret's extraordinary life of service and Caroline's remarkable sacrifice. The farm's main areas continued to operate as public gardens, but they now included a state-of-the-art visitor center that told the story of Operation Seedkeeper and honored the civilian participants who had contributed to American conservation efforts. The hidden chamber behind the ridge had been preserved as a historical exhibit, with Margaret's growing systems and preservation equipment displayed to show visitors how endangered plants had been maintained outside official conservation channels. The chamber served as a powerful reminder that the most important contributions to environmental protection often came from ordinary citizens who had the courage to serve in extraordinary ways. Emma had established the Harrison Reynolds Foundation for Conservation History, which provided funding for research into civilian contributions to species preservation and supported educational programs that taught young people about the importance of biodiversity. The Foundation's first major project was a comprehensive study of Operation Seedkeeper that would document the contributions of all the civilian participants who had participated in the program. My great-aunt taught me that the most important legacies are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the knowledge and courage to discover them, Emma said during the dedication ceremony for the Harrison Reynolds Conservation Center. Margaret spent decades preserving species and resources that she believed would be important for future generations, and she did it without any expectation of recognition or reward. And Carolyn Harrison gave up wealth, position, and even her identity to protect the natural world she loved. Emma's experience had taught her that ordinary people could make extraordinary contributions to environmental protection and to the preservation of ecological diversity. Margaret's and Caroline's stories demonstrated that conservation efforts often depended on civilians who were willing to serve in roles that would never be publicly acknowledged, and that the most valuable contributions often came from people who had the expertise and dedication to preserve important resources for future use. The center continued to attract visitors who were interested in conservation, biodiversity, and environmental history, but it now served a broader educational purpose. School groups visited to learn about ecosystem preservation. University researchers came to study the preserved species, and environmentalists brought their families to see a memorial to the civilian participants who had served alongside them. Emma had learned that her inheritance represented much more than money or property. Margaret had left her a legacy of service, a commitment to preserving ecological diversity, and an understanding of how ordinary citizens could contribute to extraordinary causes. The discovery had changed Emma's life in ways that went far beyond financial security, providing her with a sense of purpose and a connection to environmental history that would guide her future career and personal choices. The most valuable discoveries often come from paying attention to details that others overlook and having the courage to investigate things that don't quite make sense, Emma explained to visitors who toured the memorial exhibit. Margaret spent decades preserving species that she believed would be important someday, and she trusted that eventually someone would have the knowledge and determination to discover what she had preserved. Emma's story had become an inspiration to researchers, students, and ordinary citizens who understood that the most important contributions to society often came from people who were willing to ask difficult questions and pursue investigations that others might ignore. Margaret's and Caroline's legacies lived on through the research center, the foundation, and the countless people who learned from their examples of quiet service and dedication to preserving important ecological treasures. Wildflower Haven remained open as a public garden, but it had become something much more significant, a memorial to the ordinary Americans who had served their country's natural heritage in extraordinary ways, a research center for conservation, history, and a reminder that the most valuable secrets were often preserved by people who understood that biodiversity was too important to be lost to development or indifference. Emma Reynolds had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't money or fame, but the opportunity to honor the memory of people who served in silence and to ensure that their contributions to history would never be forgotten. Margaret's gift to Emma had been the chance to uncover truths that changed everything she thought she knew about her family, her country, and the power of ordinary people to preserve extraordinary legacies. 2 years after the discovery, Emma received a call that reminded her that Margaret's legacy might hold even more secrets. Dr. Kim from the National Plant Conservation Network contacted her to report that analysis of Margaret's documents had revealed references to other seedkeeper facilities that had never been located. The references suggested that Margaret had been part of a network of preservation sites, and that there might be similar discoveries waiting to be made at other locations around the country. Ms. Reynolds, your great-aunt's records indicate that Operation Seedkeeper involved at least 15 major preservation facilities, and we've only located 4 of them, Dr. Kim explained. Margaret appears to have been the coordinator for the eastern region, and her files contain clues that might help us locate the other sites and the species they contain. Emma realized that her discovery at Wildflower Haven might be just the beginning of a larger investigation into one of the most successful conservation preservation operations in American history. Margaret's legacy would continue to reveal new secrets and provide new opportunities for understanding how ordinary citizens had contributed to preserving the most important aspects of America's natural heritage. The young woman who had inherited a farm had become the guardian of secrets that would continue to educate and inspire future generations. Emma's story proved that the most extraordinary discoveries often began with the simplest observation. When something doesn't quite make sense, it's worth investigating further. And sometimes, if you have the knowledge and courage to pursue the truth, you might discover that the most valuable treasures have been waiting patiently for someone just like you to find them. The Reynolds Conservation Center quickly became a model for similar facilities across the country. Within 5 years of its establishment, 10 new conservation centers had been created based on Emma's management approach and educational philosophy. These centers, spread across diverse ecosystems from the Florida Everglades to the Pacific Northwest, formed a network of living laboratories where endangered species could be studied, preserved, and eventually reintroduced to restored habitats. Emma's integration of public education with serious scientific work created a new paradigm for conservation organizations. By making visitors active participants in preservation efforts rather than passive observers, she transformed public engagement with environmental issues. School children who visited the center didn't just learn about endangered plants. They helped propagate them, document their growth, and even participate in controlled reintroduction projects. The Heiress story captivated public imagination and became the subject of books, documentaries, and even a feature film. The tale of an heiress who abandoned wealth and privilege to protect the natural world resonated deeply in an era of growing environmental awareness. Caroline's choice to live simply and anonymously while dedicating her fortune to conservation inspired a movement among wealthy individuals to establish similar trusts and foundations. What Carolyn Harrison understood 60 years ago is something we're only beginning to fully appreciate today. Emma explained during a TED Talk that went viral with over 20 million views. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the diversity of life we preserve for future generations. Caroline realized that all her family's shipping fortune meant nothing if the ecosystems that sustained life were destroyed in the process of accumulating it. Emma's research into Operation Seedkeeper ultimately identified over 300 civilian participants who had worked secretly for decades to preserve America's botanical heritage. These individuals came from all walks of life: teachers, farmers, homemakers, doctors, mechanics, ordinary people who had made extraordinary contributions to conservation without recognition or reward. The Reynolds Foundation established a national memorial recognizing these civilian conservationists, with a wall of honor listing their names and contributions. Many families learned for the first time that their parents or grandparents had been part of this remarkable secret network, discovering a legacy of service that had been hidden for generations. My father spent every weekend in his greenhouse, but I never understood why it was so important to him, said Michael Donovan, son of a Seedkeeper participant identified through Margaret's records. Now I know he wasn't just gardening, he was saving species that might have disappeared forever. It changes everything I thought I knew about him and gives new meaning to the work he considered his life's purpose. The most profound impact of Emma's discovery came through the practical application of the preserved genetic material. The seed bank Margaret had maintained included varieties of crop plants that contained natural resistance to diseases and climate conditions that were becoming increasingly problematic as global temperatures rose and weather patterns changed. Agricultural researchers discovered that several heritage grain varieties preserved in Margaret's vault contained genetic traits that allowed them to thrive in drought conditions while maintaining higher nutritional value than modern hybridized crops. These discoveries led to new breeding programs that incorporated these resilient traits into crops that could feed vulnerable populations in changing climate zones. What Margaret and Caroline preserved wasn't just botanical history, it was the future of food security, said Dr. Sanjay Patel, director of the International Crop Diversity Institute. These seeds contain genetic solutions to problems we're only now beginning to face. They didn't just save plants. They may have saved millions of people from future food insecurity. Emma's personal journey continued to evolve in unexpected ways. She discovered through Margaret's personal journals that her great-aunt had been more than just a conservation partner to Carolyn Harrison. The two women had shared a deep, personal bond that went beyond their professional collaboration, supporting each other through decades of challenges and celebrating private victories together. Margaret and Caroline created a life that was rich in purpose and meaning. Emma wrote in her award-winning memoir, Seeds of Change. They chose a path that required sacrifice and secrecy, but their journals reveal they never regretted their choices. They measured their success not in personal recognition, but in every species saved, every ecosystem preserved, every future possibility protected. Emma's leadership extended beyond the Conservation Center as she was appointed to presidential commissions on biodiversity and elected to the National Academy of Sciences. Her integration of historical research with practical conservation created a new field that she called heritage ecology, the study of how past conservation efforts could inform current environmental challenges. 10 years after her discovery, Emma stood on a restored prairie in Nebraska, watching as school children helped plant seedlings propagated from Margaret's preserved specimens. The native grasses and wildflowers, once thought extinct in the wild, were reclaiming land that had been industrial farmland for generations. The children moved carefully through the field, learning the names and purposes of each species as they helped restore the ecosystem. "This is Margaret and Caroline's true legacy," Emma told a reporter documenting the restoration project. "Not just the plants themselves, but this connection between generations, the understanding that what we choose to preserve today determines what's possible tomorrow. These children are planting more than seedlings. They're planting possibilities." The elderly woman who had sold her family farm had set in motion a chain of discovery that transformed not just Emma's life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from the preservation of botanical diversity. Caroline Harrison's decision to change her identity and dedicate herself to conservation created ripples that continued to spread decades after her death. "We all have choices about the legacy we leave," Emma concluded in her address to the world. Conservation Congress. Carolyn Harrison chose to give up her name to save something more precious than personal recognition. Margaret Reynolds chose to protect secrets that mattered more than public acknowledgement. Their choices teach us that true meaning comes not from what we keep for ourselves, but from what we preserve for others. And in gardens and natural areas across America, plants that might have vanished forever continue to grow, their existence a living testament to the power of ordinary individuals to change the course of history through quiet, determined action. The missing heiress who chose plants over privilege, and the dedicated teacher who preserved both her secret and her legacy, had indeed left a fortune beyond measure, not in money, but in life itself, preserved for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.